Are we live? Okay. So good morning. Thank you for joining this morning. Before we begin, I would like to let everybody know that this event is being closed captioned. And so if you want that on, there's a small icon at the bottom of your Zoom client or the screen where you can turn that on for yourselves. My name's Andy Moss. I'm currently a professor at NYU. I've spent the vast majority of my career in the tech sector, running in several of their businesses. I've been a mentor and advisor to various startups. And for the last several months, I've been volunteering with the COVID Technology Task Force. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank you all for coming. As you've seen in the press over the last month or two, this is an important topic. And for those of you who are seeking information, we understand it. It's complex, it's confusing, and there's a lot of misinformation, or a lot of, I don't want to use the word misinformation, that's used too much these days, but a lot of confusing information spreading around. And I'd really like to thank the speakers for sharing their time, their perspectives, and how they're approaching dealing with these challenging situations. We've got a series of partners that have helped us spread the word, from the NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology, with the Public Interest Technology University Network from the New America Foundation, Righteous Media and the Angry American Podcast, KD Leadership Strategies, Help with COVID, BetaWorks, which we thank for all of the back end, the operations so that we can run these events, and Hanger as well. For those of you not aware, the COVID Technology Task Force is a national collection of volunteers who have come together since roughly March to help convene a series of forums with state, local governments, healthcare professionals, the business community, education sector, basically to form a collaboration and share ideas with the tech community. Many of us come out of the tech community. The goal is increased cooperation and communication towards mitigating the impact of COVID in one way, or shape, or form. Today is the latest in a series of events we've hosted. Previous events focused on data security and privacy, contact tracing, exposure notification, and we recently concluded a 10-day marathon hackathon for social and mental health. Today, we're shifting our attention to education. Everything starts with education. We all want treatments and vaccines. Well, the scientists, the doctors, the lab technicians, they all can do their part because of their education. Many other people are being empowered to mitigate the impact of COVID because of their education too. Today, we're here to discuss empowering the next generation and to solve tomorrow's challenges, from climate change to inequality that permeates too much of society. Ignoring our problems doesn't make them go away. The sciences, critical thinking, and the arts prepare the mind for making connections across disparate pieces of information that lead to breakthrough results. Today, we've assembled a wide collection of people from diverse school types across geographies to provide a comprehensive view of the challenge being confronted literally as we speak. Just this morning, NYU posted its plan for reopening. So you'll hear today from executive leadership, faculty, researchers, and even the students' perspective. And since many of us here are parents, my son is currently enrolled in his college's virtual online program for the fall. You'll no doubt hear the parents' perspective as well. So hopefully that will come through in today's conversation. We need a functional education system. That's not up for debate. How we get there is how we achieve that goal, particularly during this pandemic, is what today's event is all about. So there are three themes I think you'll pick up on today. One size does not fit all. Each institution has its own unique set of risks to mitigate and resources with which to address them. You'll hear a lot about inequality everywhere. Schools simply do not have the same finance or skills, experiences with which to figure out their own plan. We need to help ensure the outcomes they provide are common and provide a common opportunity for all. The last theme that you'll pick up on is technology can be an important enabler, but it can also create unintended problems. This is why we're focusing on bringing tech people together with the people who are actually working the issues so that we can solve problems for them. We as techies often think we have all the answers. We don't. We're best served when we listen to the experts and we build what they need. So for those of you in the tech community, please heed the calling. So I hope everyone today, participating today, attendees and speakers alike, walk away from this event with a little bit more enlightened and with some useful information that you can apply right away. I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, John Borthwick. John probably doesn't need much of an intro, but for those of you who are not familiar with him, he's the CEO of BetaWorks, and he's been leading this task force for the last several months. And I can attest that his personal goodwill has enabled many of us have access to a lot of the speakers and experts that you'll hear from today. So with that, I'd like to introduce John Borthwick.
Thank you, Andy. So on behalf of the COVID Tech Task Force, I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us today, and people who are both on stage and also the people who are joining us on Zoom. How we get to a functional educational system and launched for the rest of the year is the topic today. And I'm here as a member of the COVID Tech Task Force, as a parent and as a citizen. And I think this is one of the most important challenges that we face right now. I'm going to pass right over to Mona Sloan, who's one of the experts that Andy mentioned. Mona is a sociologist working at New York University, working on inequality and ethics in AI design and policy. Thank you for joining us today. Mona, over to you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you very much, Andy, for leading, putting together this terrific event today. So the questions and issues we are facing as we have to think about how to reopen campus life are pressing in so many ways, but they are particularly pressing in the context of the deep inequities that we see in the US in education today. So technology, as Andy has alluded to, may help us to address these, but may also exacerbate them. Now, writer Arundhati Roy has recently remarked that the pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And sociologist Alondra Nelson has reminded us that these social conditions exposed, exacerbated, and created by the novel coronavirus demand that we substantively rethink our ideas of society. Now, is this perhaps the moment for us to rethink education, equity, and technology? I want us to think about that as we move through today's event and conversations with the many wonderful experts and activists that we have invited today. And with that cue, really, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Charlton McIlwain. Charlton McIlwain serves as NYU's Vice Provost for Faculty Engagement and Development. In that role, he advances NYU's academic excellence by supporting faculty recruitment, retention, and career advancement. He also leads NYU's Center for Faculty Advancement, and I have the pleasure of working with him on building the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology. Charlton also is NYU's designee to the New America and Ford Foundation sponsored Public Interest Technology University Network, who are a co-sponsor for today's event. Charlton has been working on pushing the agenda of diversity, equality, and inclusion for many, many years. His research has also focused on this, particularly with regards to media and technology. As professor of media, culture, and communication at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, his scholarly work focuses on the intersection of race, digital media, and racial justice. He is the founder of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies and the author of the fantastic new book, came out last year, Black Software, the Internet, Racial Justice, and Racial Justice from the AFNet to Black Lives Matter by University Press. Highly recommend that book. Charlton, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Mona, and thanks as always for any kind of a plug for the book for Black Software. But I want to start my remarks today by simply saying thanks to Andy, to John for your work on this task force and for putting together these amazing sets of conversations that are absolutely timely, necessary, and I think to follow up on all the points that you have made critical as we think about the intersection of and the ability to work in tandem between the educational community and others and with the tech community. So thank you for your work. Thanks for the invitation to say a few words today as an introduction to the day's conversation. So my role today is really, in my mind, simple. It's to frame the day's conversations about the connective thread between education, technology, and the principles of safe return this fall. And when I refer to safe return, I'm referring to a return to school in the many forms that it may take for all of us this fall. whether that's in person or remote or hybrid or staggered in person or in person until we are perhaps made to go back to remote, and many of the endless permutations in between. And so I want to make some broad points in my framing. And again, I think this is an easy task because what I want to do is really to raise a set of questions and frame a conversation. And the description of today's events promised you some answers and some helpful ways about moving forward. And I'm going to leave that part to our distinguished panel of education leaders that follow my brief remarks, as well as the long list of brilliant researchers, faculty, students, developers, and others who will do the hard work of providing some specific answers to the challenges that we face, some of which I will focus on and raise over the next few minutes. So I want to begin my task of framing by first calling our attention to something that we all know. That is the fact that crisis breeds technological innovation. And our history over the past 60 years belies a predictable pattern in which this plays out time after time after time. Theoretically, crisis provides an opportunity for a society to solve problems by either doubling down on the status quo or by revolutionizing how our society systemically operates. But our history, and I'm speaking here from the position of those typically not in the position to dictate the terms of response, tend to revolutionize technology as a means to maintain the status quo, socially, politically, economically. This pattern begins with a public emergency, real or manufactured. It serves as a catalyst. It provides justification for doing extraordinary things to address the emergency, even if it means trampling the rights, the liberties, the opportunities of some. What follows in this pattern is a clarion call for tech innovation. Again, sometimes this call is an explicit one to meet the perceived need at hand. Other times it is manufactured by those who have specific interests to pursue, be those financial, political, or both. The particular formation that frequently results is a mutually beneficial partnership between the public and private sectors, often one in which one subsidizes or enables the other in some way. This formation and process produces new technologies whose abilities, purposefully or inadvertently, far exceed the immediate need for which they were designed and built. Then, once that model is built, the technology proliferates to scale. Finally, in many cases, it produces new harms, many of which are worse than the problem for which the tech was made in the first place. This pattern, of course, all plays out against a backdrop of a society that is fundamentally racist, highly segregated, where certain groups are persistently stereotyped, stigmatized, marginalized, and the usual suspects criminalized. And so first I want to remind us of the social and technological context that frames not only our current moment, but the challenges facing us this fall as we return to the work of education and the opportunities for our technological tools to do some good. Time doesn't permit me to highlight the many examples in which this pattern I just mentioned has played out decade over decade from the 60s up through the present. But the simple point I want to make is this, which is that too often we face big challenges, and even in their immensity, we face them as something that is new, something that we are seeing for the first time. And so what I want to do in part is to call attention to the fact that while the challenge of a global pandemic are a specific problem we have not had to face before in the form of COVID, our history, particularly the history of technology and its impacts, can and should provide some guidance about how we might proceed. But second, I want to continue my task of framing today's discussion by suggesting that While safety is certainly a necessary principle on which to base our various returns to the educational enterprise, a different construct should undergird our pursuits. Safety and adjacent terms like protection, security, defense, the absence of fear or anxiety have been deeply problematic constructs for us historically, particularly in the context of technology. From Lyndon Johnson's war on crime to Ronald Reagan's war on drugs to Donald Trump's war on immigrants and so much more in between, safety has historically been equated with policing, surveillance, and the proliferation of technological systems that serve them both. And so while I acknowledge the need for us to think about returning to our educational endeavors from the standpoint of controlling the spread of the deadly coronavirus, I also acknowledge that the pursuit of safety focuses our attention on potential threats to that safety. Legitimate threats in the form of a disease, as well as perceived threats, which tend to target and identify the usual suspects. And what will education be like when the environment around us is focused on identifying, mitigating, or responding to these threats? And one of the things I think is so crucial about the moment that we are in is that we're facing two imperatives that are indeed imperatives. Safety is a necessity, and so I don't want my words today to minimize the fact that a safe return is the foundation for our return in the first place, but wanting to also make sure that other things, equity and others, guide what it is and how it is we will return in the fall. So given the problematic nature of safety as a framework for guiding how we educate students from preschool to graduate school, I want to suggest that when we are not laser focused on safety, another principle should guide our educational efforts this fall, and that is equity. Safety may be the necessary and sufficient condition for our return, but for those of us who are in the business of education and the service of students, equity is what should drive our work. Equity is the challenge that we must face this fall. Equity in terms of our engagement with students, equity in terms of the technologies we design and or adopt to deploy in the service of this work. So what does equity mean in the context of technology? In the context of technologies deliberately designed for or otherwise used in the service of education? I will confess that I'm not sure I can answer this question, but I think it's important to pose it. But let me start by addressing what I am confident equitable technology should not and cannot mean if we are to come out of this radically different educational environment, radically different at its end, whenever that may be. Equitable technology cannot begin and end with simply technology access. And yet that is what much of our education policy does. Take, for instance, the mission and vision statement by the federal government's Office of Educational Technology under the section Equity. And this is replete within several of the reports from this office that offer this as the policy vision for the federal government's Office of Educational Technology. They write that, quote, technology can be a powerful tool for transforming learning. It can help affirm and advance relationships between educators and students, reinvent our approaches to learning and collaboration, shrink long-standing equity and accessibility gaps, and adapt learning experience to meet the needs of all learners. The Office of Educational Technology focuses on using technology to transform learning experiences with the goal of providing greater equity and accessibility. So there's a lot packed in that statement, including the terms equity and access. But if you read closely, both in this statement and what is further detailed in the other reports that are there that try to define and shape and otherwise articulate this concept of equity in the context of technology, we find that there is something missing in this sort of universal, all-encompassing way to try to provide access for all, as well as the fact that often the terms access and equity are used interchangeably and meant to define each other. Access to technology is important. If safe return to school in the fall is to be an equitable return to school in the fall, then student access to technology, ranging from broadband to smartphones, laptops, to a whole range of software applications and platforms, is a necessity. But we would be mistaken to assume that solving all of our students' access problems in turn solves our equity challenges. What we know from the legacy of the Clinton administration and the investment in developing the so-called information superhighway of the 1990s, to the experiences of so many young people forced out of schools by COVID over the past spring, is that even when our tech infrastructures provide access, and the reality, of course, as we all know, is that frequently these infrastructures in this country and around the world, where our students will be studying this fall, don't even successfully provide that level of universal access. But even when we can provide basic access to all, some are well positioned to take full advantage of that access, while others have been placed at a disadvantage. Those who have access or excesses of social capital, access to resource-rich networks, public policies that place them at the center, and incentives designed to promote and perpetuate their privilege. These are the people time and again who are well positioned to take advantage of this let's build it and expect that if we build an infrastructure of access for all, that access simply will solve these problems. Our universalizing notions of tech equity, articulated as access for all, is so universal in its outlook and application that it does not account for the specific needs, gaps, opportunities, and challenges faced by people historically marginalized by technology. Our assumption that if we build it and make it open for all, they will come, has been proven wrong time and again. Despite expanding broadband infrastructure and access across the United States, for example, extremely significant gaps in broadband adoption, use, and digital skills persist within and among particular communities based on race, ethnicity, income, and other demographic markers. My point is this: to the degree that we face the challenges of providing our students access to technology, we cannot and must not stop there. At the same time that we strive to provide access for all, we must also concern ourselves with ensuring that we don't set up some to succeed and others to fail by simply saying, you all have access now. Now you're all on equal footing, and we will expect that you will all succeed, or that you can all succeed. To say it differently, we must make sure that we specifically ensure that historically underrepresented and marginalized students are provided all of the tools, not just access to the technology, that they will need to succeed academically in the environment in which they will return, work, and live this year. To put it a different way, we cannot design, build, and deploy technologies that are colorblind, or delude ourselves into thinking that technology is not always already racialized. But having all the tools to succeed in whatever our classrooms our students enter this fall is not the only challenge, and it's not the only technology challenge our institutions face in the days ahead. And so we must ask ourselves also what tech equity looks like when our institutions might be besieged by a host of tools designed and or adopted specifically for the purpose of ensuring our safety. Contact tracing technologies, of course, first come to mind given the ubiquity of and need for the epidemiological practice across all institutions, bringing back students to campus, bringing faculty and staff back as well this fall. Contact tracing technologies have the potential to amplify what manual contact tracing has done well in public health crises like the one we currently face. Some specific applications have been built with the capacity to maintain strict levels of privacy. Some by designing apps that process data on users' mobile phones rather than by the app maker, and therefore curtailing the stockpiling of data for future use. Others by anonymizing personal data and partitioning access, ensuring that public health officials only have access to crucial data about health outcomes specifically. But I have to be honest that I remain skeptical, especially having reviewed a running list of existing and developing contact tracing applications that researchers have been tracking over the past few months. Many of them, some 100 or so, do not even articulate key privacy safeguards or lack them altogether. Many of them highlight their ability to produce a safe workplace environment by building tracing technologies that connect to existing software systems, human resource systems like Workday, for instance, that connects health data with existing data held in existing institutional systems, ranging from demographic information, pay data, performance data, and more. These applications promise safety, all the while enabling educational institutions to extend and expand our surveillance capacity well beyond the public health surveillance traditionally necessary to deal with threats like COVID-19. I won't belabor the point too much. I gave the contact tracing skepticism talk last week in a different venue, but I will simply say that as education institutions consider the need and utility of these technologies as part of how we provide safety on our respective campuses this fall and beyond, concerns about equity should weigh as heavily as our concerns about whether these technologies can help us provide a safe return. Before we design, adopt, and utilize one or more of these technologies, we must demonstrate whether and how they will serve the health needs of communities that have been disparately impacted by COVID. We must demonstrate that the technologies have the ability to mitigate bias or potentially disparate negative impact, especially for those applications that utilize predictive algorithms of one kind or another. The point I'm trying to make was perhaps better articulated in an article I wrote earlier this summer when talking specifically about the context of African Americans with respect to both COVID-19 and technology. And so I'll begin to close by reading just part of, or an excerpt of that article. Blackness and Black people both persist as our nation's, dare I say, even the world's problem. When contact tracing first cropped up at the beginning of the pandemic, it was easy to see it as a necessary but benign health surveillance tool. The coronavirus was our problem, and we began to design new surveillance technologies in the form of contact tracing, temperature monitoring, threat mapping applications, and many others to help address it. But something both curious and tragic happened. We discovered that Black people, Latinx people, and indigenous populations were disproportionately infected and affected. Suddenly, we also became a national problem. We disproportionately threatened to spread the virus. That was compounded when the tragic murder of George Floyd by a white police officer sent thousands of protesters into the streets. When the looting and rioting started, we, Black people, were again seen as a threat to law and order, a threat to a system that perpetuates white racial power. It makes you wonder how long it will take for law enforcement to deploy those technologies we first designed to fight COVID-19, to quell the threat that Black people supposedly pose to the nation's safety. If we don't want our technology to be used to perpetuate racism, then we must make sure that we don't conflate social problems like crime or violence or disease, or I will add the absence of safety, with Black and brown people. When we do that, we risk turning those people into the problems that we deploy our technology to solve, the threat we design it to eradicate. And so I've said a lot about what we shouldn't do and what we should be concerned about in terms of whether and how we advance tech equity in the educational enterprise. Let me close by briefly offering just a few broad strokes about how we might think about tech equity as we strive to provide students a safe place to learn this fall and beyond. I referenced earlier the notion that tech access does not equal tech equity. But there are other models of tech equity that exist, at least in theory. Models of tech equity rooted in ethics, in justice, in fairness, equal opportunity. But I will admit that as much as I agree with those frameworks for thinking about tech equity, I find them largely unsatisfying, largely because I have not seen too many examples where they have been clearly articulated, much less operationalized. Ethics, justice, fairness, all have been so fraught in the legal and policy context in which we typically confront them that it is so hard to imagine its direct application to the health tech realm. And so I want to end by suggesting that, at least for now, or at least as a thought exercise that might potentially provide a useful framework for decision-making in our campuses this fall, that we borrow a model of equity from the world of finance and banking. I find some potential there for a model of equity that might be thoughtfully extended to how we design, develop, and deploy technology. Equity in this model is premised on a few core concepts that include ownership, stakeholding, and value or value sharing. And so I conclude by simply asking, what would our technology concerns and decisions be based on at our institutions this fall if we thought of our students, faculty, and staff as owners of the technologies that we deploy in the name of their safety? After all, ownership isn't just about making a financial purchase or securing the rights to a material object. It is about a relationship between those engaged in a transaction and a relationship between a purchaser and the object itself. And so how might things look differently if we began by asking the question, what is our community's relationship to technology? Or what relationship do specific members of our communities have to the technologies that we employ? Further, what would it or could our campuses be like if those within our educational community had and understood themselves to have an ownership relationship with the tools that we deploy in the name of keeping them safe? How might our communities be different if our constituents had full knowledge of what is at stake for them and the decisions we make about what data we collect, how we will use it to keep them safe, or how we can be vigilant about making sure that decisions driven by that data aren't disparately applied? What if we could ensure and articulate to those at the center and on the margins of our community who stand to benefit how they can and will extract value from the expanded deployment of existing, new, and newly applied technologies across our educational communities? And with that, I will be done. Thank you.
I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly. I think today was truly awesome. I'm getting feedback from lots of folks. I think Charlton did an amazing job kicking things off. We covered how to mitigate the spread. We've talked about what the classroom, the infrastructure that's taking place, the outside the classroom learning, a lot of the risks around some of the data that's taking place. So I hope everybody walks away today with something really interesting and useful information. There are a couple of themes that I picked up on. Trust. We have a clear void right now, and we need to rebuild it one person at a time, one school at a time, one community at a time. Empathy. Everybody talked about empathy. We're all in this together. Let's not forget that. Flexibility. policy-wise, class schedules, in how and what the curriculum is delivered. We all need to be flexible because we don't know what we'll learn tomorrow. So we can't be locked in to what we commit to today. We have to learn how to be flexible and adapt. There's also an optimism. While this is a bleak period of our history, it has a silver lining. It sparked a long, long overdue awareness of systemic inequalities in our system. And I think that came through loud and clear that people are aware of it. And the first half of fixing a problem is awareness. So I think there's a growing awareness of really rectifying that for the first time in a really, really long time. Education is way more than the classroom. Pre-K through adult lifelong learning. That's really the challenge in front of us. It's not the institutions, it's how people learn. And I think we're seeing some innovation recognizing that there's going to be not just what happens in the classroom and on the campus, but new ways and new styles of learning that are going to emerge. They've been incubating for a while and they're coming to the surface. And the last thing I'll offer is slow down. We all have been operating at such a high pace. We need to slow down. We need to find the human connection wherever you can. And with that, I thank you all for attending. I thank all the speakers for participating and giving their time for such a great conversation. And with that, I will say, be well, stay safe, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.